These next three uh, lecture components are going to be based in further analyzing the four ways that people identify as Indian. The defined by law, defined biologically, defined culturally, and self-defined. So we're going to take a look initially at this one about legally defined Indians. How does law define an Indian? And one of the funny things, as maybe it's not funny, haha, but it's funny in terms of irony and other things, is Indians being the most free people in the world prior to the coming of the Europeans are now subject to more laws than any other people in the United States. We are subject to laws primarily because of the fact that our tribes had a political relationship with the federal and state governments as they are throughout the history of the development of North America. And so we had often we had very uh, complex and formal relations with the governments of England and France and to a lesser degree Spain. And we had very, very formal agreements with the United States through treaties, and over the years, those treaties have also been um, added to and interpreted through congressional law and court decisions, all of which impact the lives of Indian people. Um, so, the idea of law defining Indian is something that, to a certain degree, we're kind of used to because we have so many different kinds of laws that affected us. But there's two laws in particular: the Indian Reorganization Act 1934 and the Public Law 93-638, as well as a couple of others that have actually identified and said this is what an Indian is. And the original definition of Indian for the purpose of federal legislation in the Indian Reorganization Act said that an Indian is a person who has 1/4 or more degree of Indian blood, and that has changed over the years. And But that was the original federal definition of Indians in 1934. Now, um, other aspects of legally defined Indians, we look at tribal roles, and back in the for some tribes it was during the treaty days, but other tribes it was during what we call the allotment period, which is a particular part of federal Indian policy in the 1880s, 90s, and early part of the 20th century, where reservations were divided up and taken from the communal ownership of the tribe and given to individual Indians. Each individual Indian got 160 acres. Well, they had to figure out, well, who's going to get this land? Who's going to be eligible for this 160 acres? And so they established what they call a base roll, meaning these are the people who are Indians recognized on the date that we decided to divide up the reservation. And these base rolls have become the basis for Indian tribes identifying who their members are. Originally came from the feds, and there's people who never got on the rolls. We got to admit that there's people who were so suspicious of the government that there's no way they're going to give their name up. There's no way that they're going to come in and sign their paperwork. And so, a lot of times we have people who never showed up, who by all means and purposes are considered native or a member of that tribe, but they don't show up, their names or their ancestors' names don't show up on the rolls. Now you take that base roll, and then tribal constitutions and tribes have ordinances to define who is a member of the tribe, and so those rolls have been added to over the years. Every tribe has the right to determine its membership. And they also have the right to determine the process by which a person becomes a member. Some tribes it's just automatic. You're born and your parents are tribal members, and you've got whatever blood requirement that the tribe might have, if they have one, then you're automatically on the rolls. On the other hand, some tribes require that you make an application to the tribal council and they vote you in. I mean, there's just a whole many varieties. Remember, there's at this point 556 federally recognized tribes, and there's therefore 556 ways that people become Indian depending on the basis of that tribe, how they become a tribal member. And it's a legal status, and it's a legal status based on the political relationship between the tribe and the federal government. But in addition to that political relationship with the tribe and the federal government and the authority of the tribe to control their land and control who are citizens of that tribal nation, there are also states that have laws that determine who an Indian is for the state's purpose. The state may have some special programs or something like that for Native Americans. I know the state of Utah has some kind of a disbursement of money from oil revenues from a certain area in Utah, and people have to be a tribal member from that tribe and from that area in order to be eligible for that. So there's a lot of different ways that laws have been passed by the tribes, by the federal government, by the state, to define what an Indian is. Now we're going to take a little bit of time looking at biologically defined Indians, which is a really whole. They're kind of connected. The legal and the biologically are defined kind of together. And the reason for this is that a lot of times the basis for having a legal definition of being Indian is based in your blood quantum. And essentially, these biological definitions are racist. They came out of a period of time in the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where the notion of racial purity was very, very important in the eyes of many people in the United States. It was felt that a person's character, that their ambition of life, their position in life, whether they're going to be rich or poor, all of that was based in their blood or their genes. And this particular period of time in the United States was a period of time not only where this idea of racial purity was being imposed between the whites and the African Americans, but also it was applied to natives. And so this whole idea of defining Indians biologically comes out of that particular period of time. Now, when we talk about biologically defining Indians, we're talking to a large degree about phenotypes. And phenotype, the word pheno means blood, but it really talks about what kinds of physical characteristics that people have that are passed down from generation to generation. And then we know that there are races on Earth, and we know that these races have different phenotypes. And so people have backed out and said, well, these phenotypical markers are the way that you determine who is a Native American. And so some of the typical phenotypical markers are things like hair color and hair texture. Skin tone. What's the color of the skin? What's your physical size? Are you small or are you large? I mean, this kind of goes a little bit with race, but also goes more with where you live where your ancestors were on the planet. Eye color is also one of the phenotypical markers. And so when we look at these phenotypical definitions, then we begin to say, well, what are the ones that are usually associated with Indians? Think about it for a minute. What are some of the ultimate phenotypical Indian stereotypes? And so you look at the buffalo head pinny, you look on the backside, and there's that picture of that Indian guy. You look at the Pocahontas movie, and what is the phenotypical appearance that comes out in that movie, or any other mass media type thing. These phenotypical imagery are maintained in the media. Now, one part of the biological definition of Indians is a phenotype, but it's not something that you see. Most of the time when we deal with phenotypes, we see things: eye color, hair color, texture, skin tone. But blood quantum is a phenotype, how much particular racial background blood do you have? And blood quantum has been used to define Indians since the beginning of the relations with individual Indians and the federal government. Or some of the early treaties talked about giving land to people who are at least 1/4 degree of a particular blood, 1/4 degree of blood of a particular tribe who signed the treaty. This goes back to the 1840s and 1850s. And then there's the Indian Allotment Act of the early 1880s, which was the basis for these tribal rolls. All of these, excuse me, were based in blood quantum. You go up to the Indian Reorganization Act, a person has to be 1/4 more degree of Indian blood. And so we have this, but it's kind of interesting. This is one of the truly racist parts of the biological definition of Indians, because it starts with the assumption that all Indians were full blood at one time. And first of all, we have to say that we don't look at ourselves as Indians, but we're members of tribes. And so if we can't start off with the assumption that all members of a tribe were full blood at one time, and there's a reason for that. And that's for we've been dealing with the Europeans since 1492, but we dealt with this land called North America, or Turtle Island, including both North and South America, for a minimum of 15,000 years, based on conservative estimates of anthropologists, up to 50 or 60,000 years in some of the more recent anthropological data and archaeological data that's coming out. And so we look at the reality that we have intermarried. We've taken captives in war. We've traded slaves. We've intermarried with so many people. We have these confederacies, the Iroquois Confederacy, and there's confederacies all across the Abnaki Confederacy, the Big Fire Confederacy, Blackfeet Confederacy, the Pueblo Confederacy. So many tribes were confederated that we know that there was tremendous amounts of intermarriage between them. There's also intermarriage because people were fighting and raiding and taking captives, and so no tribe had pure blood to begin with. The tribal blood is mixed tremendously, and so we started off with the fact that it wasn't European blood, but we don't have any particular tribe that has, quote, full bloods, because of the intermarriage that had gone on for so long. So that was the first false assumption. And then we move into this 1/4 more degree Indian blood, meaning that you had one grandparent that was Indian. That would apply to give you that Indian blood. And so what we see, though, is we look at this policy of blood quantum and say, well, why are Indians defined by blood quantum? Of all the ways we can define Indian, why are we looking at blood quantum? And it may have been an easy way to do things back in the 1880s, but today it really raises some interesting questions. First of all, for the past probably 100 years, Indian people have been the most exogamous minority group in the United States. And what that exogamous means is you marry outside of your culture group. So Indian people have been marrying out of their culture group for at least for 3 generations. I mean, maybe even more. And you look at intermarriage between non-Indians with basically Europeans or African Americans, but there's also intermarriage with other tribes that continues, and so people's tribal blood quantum gets diminished with each time that there's children produced from a exogamous relationship. Now this is kind of a real challenge, because when we look at that blood quantum where Indian people are constantly losing their status as Indian because of their intermarriage, we compare that with what's known as the one-drop rule, which applies to African Americans. And the one-drop rule basically says that if a person has 1 drop of African blood, they're still considered black. They're considered African Americans. And so So that means that Indians can gradually become not Indians, but black people can't really not become African American. And so, what's the basis for this? What's the reason that we would have that kind of two separate kinds of policies for minorities within the United States? One minority is supposed to disappear, the other minority is always supposed to be there. What's the basis for